Tonight, Vice President Mike Pence will officially accept his renomination as he highlights the Republican theme tonight, America as a Land of Heroes, at the Republican National Convention. Pence will address the nation from Fort McHenry in Baltimore. Second Lady Karen Pence will also speak. They'll be joined by Republican Senators Marsha Blackburn and Joni Ernst, and Counselor to the President Kellyanne Conway. Conway is departing the White House at the end of next week to spend more time with her family. Last night, the party focused on a positive view of the country. First Lady Melania Trumps spoke from the White House Rose Garden. She said her husband will always tell you where he stands and wants nothing more for the country than to prosper. She also expressed condolences to families impacted by the coronavirus, a message largely absent from previous speakers.
I want to acknowledge the fact that since March, our lives have changed drastically. The invisible enemy, COVID-19, swept across our beautiful country and impacted all of us. My deepest sympathy goes out to everyone who has lost a loved one, and my prayers are with those who are ill or suffering.
The night was short on specifics of tackling issues impacting Americans right now, including racial unrest, climate change, and the pandemic itself. CBS News senior political analyst and 60 Minutes correspondent John Dickerson joins me now from Washington with more. Hi, John. Good evening to you. What differences did you notice between days 1 and 2 of the convention, and what do you expect to carry over into this third night?
Well, good evening, Elaine. It's good to be with you. Well, the first night was, basically the differences in every night have been the first hour has been red meat, raw and wriggling, and then the second hour has been a little bit more crafted. And the first night you saw Nikki Haley and Senator Tim Scott speak more broadly, not so much about those red meat issues, although they were plenty critical of Joe Biden. And that slightly softer tone, of course, was echoed by the First Lady. She gave and those three speeches, let's group them all together, are pretty traditional campaign speeches. They've got a little criticism in them, but they've got some hope and they've got some broader talk about Republican themes. The challenge for the Republican convention when Donald Trump is the nominee, though, is he is so indelible as a candidate and as a human being that anything that might try to soften or change his stature in the public mind is short-lived, because he is such a personality that he will reassert himself quickly thereafter and basically become the centerpiece of his campaign pretty quickly, no matter what they say in the speeches.
Right, yeah, he has such a command of his spotlight that he has there. Well, we rarely ever hear from First Lady Melania Trump. She did deliver that message of empathy about the coronavirus and racial injustice. And I wonder, John, what were your thoughts on her speech? And do you expect to see more of her on the campaign trail?
She hasn't been much of a campaigner before. She stayed pretty much out of the limelight. So I'm not guessing that we'll see a great deal more of her. There is some appeal to Republican voters, but I just don't think they're going to have her out there a lot, in part because also campaigning is not really what it once was. She sounded some of those notes on the coronavirus clearly and talked about racial unrest in America. But again, what was notable is that she said them in part because of the paucity of remarks from the president himself. And so it's a bit of a low bar. The tradition with American presidents is that you would have a president who would speak regularly to the pain of the nearly 180,000 Americans who have died and their families. And that hasn't happened. And so by contrast, her speech is notable. But it's not a great contrast if the president is faring so poorly on his handling of COVID-19. And polls show that 60% of the country thinks or disapproves of the way he's handling it. And his lack of empathy, saying at one point the death count is what it is part of the reason his numbers are so bad on that issue.
Well, you touched on this a moment ago, John, but have you sensed much of an effort from the party to attempt to soften the president's sharper edges or strike a more conciliatory tone? And if so, who precisely are those kinds of messages aimed at?
Well, that's part of the puzzle of this convention. Who are they trying to hit? We know what the base where the base is. They love the president. They see nothing wrong with him. Then there are those voters who the president has been shedding for almost since he's been elected. And those are suburban voters, older voters, and some people who voted against Hillary Clinton in 2016, but not exactly for Donald Trump. Some of those voters can take a second look at Donald Trump during the convention, and if they see these softer messages, if they see somebody like Ambassador Nikki Haley testifying to him, or at least even just appearing at the convention, they might say, oh, well, you know, he's not so bad, and give him a second look. In terms of switching over voters who are totally gone, that's probably unlikely to happen. If you're going to do that, you have to really pound home the message, and they haven't done that as much on those kind of what we might call softer themes. And so, because that's just very, very hard to do. And I think the real strategy from the Trump team is basically to try to drive up his base that doesn't need to hear so many more softer messages. He just wants to turn out more of them than he did in 2016. And there's some evidence that there are a lot of voters out there who are in the group that he did well with that didn't vote in 2016, and he's trying to get more of them out to the polls.
So if that's the case, John, the president has said a lot about the protests turning violent, and he's talked about protecting statues. He's talked less about the root causes of some of those demonstrations. Do you think that we will likely hear more then of this law and order theme moving forward, rather than, as the First Lady talked about, reflections on this moment of racial reckoning that we're in right now?
He might touch on those themes a little, again, to tell those Republican voters who might be on the fence, you know, that he does at least acknowledge these sets of issues. But he's not going to give a full-throated explication of the American racial landscape. It's not really in his set of attributes, qualities, or interests. So it is more likely, based on past performance and everything we've seen at the campaign, is that he will continue to paint a picture of American carnage, sort of American carnage 2, if you'll remember that phrase from his inauguration. And that is what America would look like if Joe Biden were to be president. And he will point to Wisconsin and Oregon and Seattle and say this is what the entire country will look like. And that's to do two things. One, increase his sort of hardcore base and the number of people who fall into that camp, and then also frighten some suburban voters. Basically, this is coming your way, sort of frighten them into his camp. The challenge, of course, with that message is that every time you do that, you act as a turnout mechanism for African Americans who hear him talk about the danger to the suburbs and recognize that as an implicit, or in some cases explicit, racial appeal, and that will turn them out for Joe Biden.
Interesting. I want to ask you about Vice President Mike Pence, who is speaking tonight. How does the role that Mike Pence has carved out for himself compare to that of his recent predecessors? And has he made his future ambitions known?
He hasn't made his future ambitions known. It's rare that a vice president doesn't think about the presidency. Dick Cheney was probably the last one who really didn't have strong presidential ambitions that he mulled over while he was a vice president. He thought about it beforehand and decided he didn't want to do it. So, you know, Mike Pence has been extremely loyal to the president. If there's one attribute the president really holds in higher regard than anything else, it's loyalty. And Mike Pence, who, it's funny, during the 2016 convention when he was picked, so many Republicans told me, oh, it's wonderful, Mike Pence will kind of soften Donald Trump and kind of bring him into the fold and sort of prepare him to put on the jacket of the presidency. And one of the signature elements of the Trump presidency, of course, is that he has refashioned the job to him. The job has not refashioned Donald Trump. Nevertheless, Mike Pence has found his place. Traditionally, vice presidents attack the opposition, but we are in a stage now where both parties spend all their time attacking the opposition for all of their convention. It used to be kind of the vice president's job and everything else was sunshine and rainbows. And now it's just everybody has a shot at the other team. And so he will talk about the accomplishments of the administration. And then I think he has one thing he can say nobody else can, which is as the head of the coronavirus task force, he can testify to the president's response. The problem or challenge for him is that if there's too much happy talk, it is in fact the happy talk that is a part of why the country disapproves of the job the president has done, because he has constantly said things were going to be better than they actually turned out to be. And so that's a tightrope for him to walk. But he's got an incredible setting there at Fort McHenry, which is where Francis Scott Key got the inspiration for the Star-Spangled Banner.
Right, and we look forward to his remarks tonight. John Dickerson, John, will also be listening for more broadly, as you put it, quote, red meat, raw, and wriggling. John, always great to have your insight. Thank you so much, John.
Thanks, Elaine.